Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fourth talk in our series during Fall 21 titled Olmsted's Brain, Discovering Health in Urban Places and Wild Spaces. This has been a wonderful series that has been part of a course titled Nature and Brain Health at Trinity College, and it's been organized in honor of the 200th birthday of Fredrick Law Olmsted in 2022. Before we get started with our guest speaker today, which I'm very excited about, I'd like to share with you an opportunity to participate in a study on nature and health that we are collaborating with the Harvard T.H. Chan School on. It's a very simple self-guided survey, and you can access it through these QR codes that are on the screen right now. So you could take a screenshot of this. You might find it if you're watching the recording, or you're welcome to email me for information at susan.massino@trincal.edu. It's a very short pre-nature survey. Then you have your own experience in nature, and then you can take the post-nature survey. So it's very straightforward, and it's a multi-institutional effort, and greatly appreciate your considering participating in it. So without further ado on that, I'd like to just formally tell you a little bit about this series this fall. We started this class and this series because there's been such a recognition of the health benefits of nature, and such a recognition that nature and natural systems are the key to addressing our global crises in climate and species extinction. So we really need to talk about new science, diverse perspectives, and the role that both urban places and wild spaces play in our health and well-being now and long into the future. And nature is something that we need everywhere for everyone. And we've had a series of presentations ranging from history, emerging science, ongoing science, like I just shared with you, public policy. And the last talk in this series will be on December 2nd, also on a Thursday at 2 o'clock at this same Zoom link, same bat time, same bat channel. And that talk is titled Why We Need New National Parks. And it will be presented by Michael Kellett of the organization Restore. So without further ado, I'd like to invite my student, Dorothy Annika, to formally invite our esteemed guest speaker today. Dorothy.
Thank you, Professor Massino. Hello, everyone. Today we welcome Dr. Dennis Louis, Vice President of Education, E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation. E.O. Wilson is strongly associated with the term biophilia, the notion that we, as a species that evolved on Earth, have an innate interest in organisms and living processes. We are part of nature. We love nature, and yet we are in the midst of an intense extinction crisis across the many scales of biodiversity. Dr. Dennis will explore ways in which the scientific approach can complement and harmonize with the informal ways that diverse people interact with and respond to nature. A mantra of the Half Earth Project is to leave no species behind, but species is a human statistical construction, an abstract population of living things. Can big data and digital tools like the Half Earth Map help people to love and save statistical creatures as an expression of biophilia? We are yet to find out. Welcome, Dr. Dennis, and we are delighted to hear a presentation titled Leave No Species Behind, Saving Nature and Ourselves, or the Many Faces of Biophilia, Harmonizing Science and Nature Experiences. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. What a terrific introduction. And thank you, Professor Massino. Susan, thanks so much for this invitation. This is really exciting for me. I forgot how ambitious my abstract was. We'll see. I'll get as far along as we can. I would really love to teach a whole course in this if possible. So I'm going to go ahead and use slides. I'm going to ask you to use the chat some, and I'm going to encourage you as questions occur to you, put them in the chat. You know, maybe we won't get to all of them now, but I would be happy to follow up with anyone who wanted to talk about any of these things some more. So I'm going to share my screen now and get started with my slides. All right, everyone can see that okay, and everyone can hear me?
Looks great. Sounds great.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to really even broaden my theme more. What I really want to talk about is who we are. Who are we as a species? And obviously that involves who you are as an individual. And I want you to be thinking about who you want to be. That's going to be determined by your past, by your current experiences, and all sorts of things going forward. So that's the overall big framing for what I'd like to talk about. Now, you know, this cartoon by Randall Munroe, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He is a consummate, he has a very clever way of getting at data and showing simple, clever ways to make certain big data points. So this represents all the land mammals on our planet by weight. And this is a good encapsulation of who we are. The current human population is about 7.7 billion. That's represented by the dark squares in the middle. But importantly, all the gray squares are all the domestic species that we've developed and that have come along with us. And so the main point of this graphic is to show that these green squares representing the wild animals, what we think of as, you know, all the other species, just the mammals though, they've been reduced, they've been crowded out. So if you would just turn back the clock to 1800, all the various shades of gray would be much, much reduced, and there'd be lots more green. So this is sort of an explanation of, you know, where we are now. I mean, this is a characterization of where we are now, but it's not an explanation of where we are now. So now I'd like you to use the chat, and I want to ask you this question. Have you ever owned a dog or a cat? I know there's lots of other pets out there, but I'm just going to focus on dogs and cats, partly because they're big and they're carnivorous. So enter in the chat, dog, cat, or both. Okay, we're getting lots of answers, and I think there's about 20 of us here. Okay, there's a none, there's a neither, another neither. Okay, both. Okay, full disclosure, I've been principally responsible for 4 dogs and 2 cats in my lifetime. I've helped raise other pets, including other dogs, but I've had 4. So now we're going to come back to this point in a little bit, because this depiction of mammals on the planet includes all these pets that we love so much. Now, I want to introduce some of the philosophical underpinning, some of the observations of the state we're currently in. And I'd like to use, I'd like to have Professor Laurette Savoy help us with this. She wrote a book a few years back called Trace. She identifies as a Black American and a Native American. And in Trace, her family, like many American families, have lived in lots of different parts of the country. They draw from different cultures and traditions and come from different lands. And so she used this family history to explore our nation, the way names have come about, the way we use the land. And I'm going to let Laurette introduce E.O. Wilson, the founder of our organization and our mentor. She quotes Ed from his book, The Diversity of Life. And she says, Our troubles arise from the fact that we do not know what we are and cannot agree on what we want to be. The primary cause of this intellectual failure is ignorance of our origins. Humanity is part of nature. So we're a species that evolved among other species, and the more closely we identify ourselves with the rest of life, the more quickly we'll be able to discover the sources of human sensibility and to acquire the knowledge on which an enduring ethic, a sense of preferred direction can be built. And Lorette goes on to comment, perhaps danger lies most basically in not recognizing who and what we are. And this is really the general deep underpinning of the biodiversity crisis that we're in currently. Now, so Trace is a great book. I recommend checking it out. Diversity of Life is one of Ed's many books. And I just wanted to briefly talk about the Half Earth Project because it's one of the main things that our foundation works on. And it's inspired by Ed's book that he published in 2017 called Half Earth. And we're turning Half Earth into a project with specific goals. So I'm going to have the McGrath boys introduce you now to the Half Earth Project.
I made some pictures at kindergarten, and now I'm selling them for money, and I'm gonna give the money to the Half Earth Project.
Okay, let's see the art.
Here's one of the pictures. There's another of the pictures. There's another of the pictures.
Do you think people are gonna come by and want to buy the art? And then what are you gonna do with the money?
Donate it to the Half Earth Project.
Okay. Why do you want to do that?
It's because I'm really passionate about the Amazon, and I really want to protect it. So I'm doing this.
Okay. Thanks.
So it's great to have adherents like that. And part of what these boys are expressing is it's an expression of their biophilia, that they're so excited about this project. And obviously they have an awareness of the problems that the world are in, and they want to do something about it. So our project is aimed at building a movement culture. We really want to be an umbrella organization. We do work on discovering new species because it turns out that the vast majority of species on the planet are not even discovered. They don't even have a name. We're mapping biodiversity because by using modern digital mapping, that is an excellent conservation tool, and we can be rigorous about looking at and evaluating different conservation strategies. And I mostly work in the education arena. So we want to inspire and educate people. We're trying to build communities, and all of this aimed at taking both just and useful conservation action. And I'm just going to wrap up this introduction to the Half Earth Project and the foundation with a quick quote from the book. This is the culmination. Ed Wilson is now 92 years old. He's published over 30 books. He's working on 2 right now as we speak. But Half Earth, he came to the conclusion that people understand and need a goal. And so we need this sort of moonshot goal. They need a victory, not just knowing that progress is being made. They yearn for finality. And you know, the take-home message is conservation works. Whether you're taking individual or community action, it absolutely works. And the Half Earth Project provides a way for showing all the progress that goes toward this big goal, which involves thousands of smaller projects distributed around the globe. So now for the most of this talk, I want to get into Ed's head a little bit. And as I mentioned, he's written 30 books. So it's something anyone can do. You can get access to Ed's thinking. My personal favorite book of Ed's is Naturalist. It was first published in the mid-90s, and it's his memoir. It tells the story of a young man with not tons of advantages, but also not every disadvantage. And one of the things I'm really excited about is the fact that just this past year, a graphic version has been released. So this makes it accessible to all sorts of audiences that probably would have never looked at The Naturalist before, and now they can get some exposure to E.O. Wilson's life and some of his ideas. So here, I'll just show a few frames from this, a few pages from this graphic novel. This one is an example of Ed being very philosophical. He's a very accessible writer, but he's a deep thinker. And so he's talking here about how, really before modern science, it was easy for humans to think that they were separate from nature, that we were dark angels waiting for redemption, and that we really looked to the afterlife as much as stewardship over the current circumstances. The book goes on, and you can do great things in graphic novels because, for example, in the original Naturalist, of course, Ed is reminiscing and interpreting his past life. In a graphic novel, you can show old Ed actually present with his younger self. And he was one of these kids, like I imagine, like the McGrath boys, who grew up just fascinated with nature, wanting to chase things, wanting to be in nature. And he even talks about some of this being an interest in sort of monsters and some of the scary aspects of nature. Now, as he gets older, he gets deeply engaged and early on makes the decision that he really wants a career in science, but in particular focused on understanding the natural world. And again, you can do really interesting things in a graphic novel, like in the bottom two panels where young Ed has actually made some original discoveries about ants, and he's sharing it with his older self. And Ed talks about actually looking at some of the notes he made when he was a teenager. And then Ed likes to say every kid has a bug period, and he never grew out of his. And part of what I'd like to encourage everyone in this audience today is to think about if you, returning to your bug period, if you never had a bug period, it's never too late. And really, there's every reason to start engaging with nature as deeply as you can, including because of the health benefits, which we'll talk about a little bit as I go on. So of Ed's many ideas, 30 books, of his many ideas, the one I'm probably going to focus on most is Biophilia. He wrote a very short book, again, very readable, very personable. And it sparked a lot of interest. The term biophilia actually is an older term. The psychologist Eric Fromm is credited with coining the term, but in our era, Ed has really popularized this notion. And, there's lots of different ways that it's been phrased, but it's this, I'll use this definition. It's the innate human tendency to focus on and affiliate with life forms and life-like processes. Some people have become so engaged and interested in this idea that it's really been formalized into a biophilia hypothesis. Now, so I want to mention here that there are critics and challenges to the biophilia hypothesis. And it's really based on these key words: innate, and affiliation with life forms and processes. But innate is kind of the key word that tends to raise some of the controversy about it. So I just wanted to point out one paper that is it's a bit much, actually. I don't know that I would suggest reading the whole paper, but they very rigorously cover many of the objections to the biophilia hypothesis. And I guess what I would say, my interest as a scholar is not necessarily really in testing this hypothesis. For me, it's a given that we evolved on this planet, that we depend on these other life forms. So being able to test rigorously whether this is adaptive in our evolution, that we can identify, for example, genes that might be responsible for this, I don't know if that's a realistic expectation, at least in any time soon. So I accept biophilia as it's a psychological state that I find is true, and I've talked to lots of people about it. So let me just talk about some of the support for it. So one of the principal objections to biophilia is that there's also biophobia. And some of you may have this. If anyone is an arachnophobe, for example, it's quite common to be afraid of spiders. You can go ahead and enter that in the chat if you don't like spiders. And now it's so strong for some people, I'm going to warn people that I'm going to show a picture of a snake, because some people's snake phobia is so bad that if they see this picture that I'm showing right now, they would have to shut their camera off. So there's a couple ideas around that. You know, one is that spiders and snakes, and by the way, this is an endangered indigo snake from Southeast US, actually dependent, lives in longleaf pine forest, dependent on gopher tortoises. So it's a complex ecological relationships it has. That's largely why it's endangered. I find these beautiful, but obviously some people have this innate revulsion to these things. And there's some evidence that there's genetic variants that can help explain these phobias. Now, and some people would argue that these phobias are actually good evidence for the overall context of biophilia, and that there's particular species that we have, through evolution, have learned to be particularly wary of. So that's one aspect of this. And then there's another thing about nature, and those of us who love nature can tend to romanticize it. But there can be a yuck factor about biological interactions, about species interactions. So this is a photo I've taken of a great blue heron preying on a bullfrog. You know, I find this sort of animal behavior fascinating. I would never personally hurt a bullfrog, but this is the process of life. And the reality, of course, is that as interrelated species on the planet, we're interdependent on each other, and that does include some struggle, predator-prey relations, things that as people living in society can make us feel uncomfortable. Now I want to get back to the pet question and point out a book by Peter Christie called Unnatural Companions. And Peter in this book does an incredible, very deeply researched job of looking at the pet industry globally and the effect that it has on the environment. As I disclosed, I've had cats and dogs, and I think Peter is very sensitive to the fact that the point isn't to make people feel guilty about owning pets, but that it is likely an expression of biophilia. And in a video interview I did with Peter, I think he said it so well. The real point is, one, we should be as responsible a pet owners as we possibly can be, and that our pets are not enough nature. It's not, you know, the world, it's almost becoming like pets or nature. Well, we really need both. And so, you know, so many of us love our pets. Well, remember to love the wild nature as well. I included this pamphlet from the pet industry on the right. And of course, they're touting the economic impact of the pet industry and how big it is. But of course, that very size is what adds up to a huge environmental impact. Many of you may be aware that domestic cats in the US alone that are allowed to roam free, it's estimated that domestic cats kill between 1 and 4 billion birds, wild birds every year, and an astounding 6 to 20 million mammals every year. So it's a staggering impact. But even if, you know, you're a very responsible dog and cat owner, just the protein that these animals consume every year is huge. It's estimated that it's about equivalent to the amount of meat that France consumes. So one of the biggest environmental impacts we can have, obviously, to get back to this Randall Munroe cartoon, would be to eat less meat. Eating less meat would help. If France went vegetarian and we stopped feeding so much meat to our pets, we could save 2 France's worth of biodiversity. So the theme of this series is about, you know, brain health and the value of nature. So I wanted to just talk briefly about why we should care about biodiversity. And I like to categorize it into 2 main bins. There's aesthetic and ethical reasons, you know, and traditionally, the topic of this course is put into that category. Nature is calming and healing. And there's abundant evidence that this is true. So abundant is the evidence, and you've heard some of this in previous talks, that some people would argue we should move this over to the utilitarian side of things. Now, me personally, you know, I find species fascinating. So that's still the main thing that motivates me. And an increasing recognition that species have their own interests and they have a right to exist. And to point out that the viewpoint that species have interests and a right to exist is present in many cultures across the planet. So what seems like this dominant notion, I'll call it a Western notion that, you know, we have dominion over nature. That is not actually the most common way to view biodiversity and nature. And of course, on the utilitarian side, there's all these important things that, you know, we absolutely depend on other species for our very lives. Clean water, clean air, food, and energy. The planet doesn't need us as a species. We completely depend on all the other species. And biodiversity, as Ed says, biodiversity forms a shield that protects all of us. So eroding it is really at our risk. And then there's very particular aspects of the value of nature. We get specific medicines from nature. In fact, most of the medicines that we have were all discovered not through really a directed scientific process, but through serendipity, learning from nature, making observations from nature. Now, I'm interested in the question, so the context of which I think about these things is biophilia, and meaning that we need to recognize we're part of nature. There's no living apart from nature. It doesn't matter whether you're in a city, in the suburb, in the countryside, wherever on the globe you live, we're all part of nature and dependent on nature. Now, again, in the West, in the developed world, there's a general recognition that being outside is healthy for us. And I'm interested in the quality of these experiences and how much those might affect your health. And one of the things, another way that I think about this, a whole separate thing that I'm very interested in, is something that I call exercise is medicine. And again, similar to the health benefits of being in nature, there's perhaps even more abundant evidence that exercise literally is the most powerful medicine that you can have. It corrects it keeps you healthy, and it can correct all sorts of health problems. So I'm interested in applying this idea in some ways to nature experiences. So duration of nature experiences and intensity of nature experience. So in the case of exercise, there's some evidence that low intensity exercise activates different parts of your brain and has different effects on your cognition. High intensity compared to high intensity exercise, which has different impacts on your brain. And that maybe these are complementary things, and we need both of these things. Now, Ed says it poetically. Another way to think about this in a more general and less phrased as a science experiment is that biodiversity is like a magic well. The more you draw from it, the more there is to draw. So this notion that as you engage more with nature, you find more, you get more health, you get all sorts of benefits as you engage more deeply and more actively. So now I'd like to do a little experiment. I'm going to ask you to just think of one species. Think of a snail. Let's take a second. Okay, so you've all got a picture of a snail. I'm assuming that most of you have an image somewhat like this. So that's a land snail. Terrestrial snails, I think there's something like 6,000 species. It turns out though, that most snails are marine snails. Most of them live in the ocean. Okay, so now I'm going to show you a video, and I just want you to watch the video and observe what happens. I may make some comments as the video plays, at least at the beginning here. So this is my friend Toto Oliveira. He's originally from the Philippines, grew up fascinated with seashells and started studying marine snails. And here is in a tank, a snail and a fish. You can see the proboscis moving around, and what has happened is this snail has harpooned that fish and is now engulfing the fish live. You can see that the fish is paralyzed, actually in a way that's very similar to if you were hit by a taser. So the snail is engulfing the fish and pulling it directly into its gastric system, and it's going to digest this fish whole. So what we think of as a slow-moving creature has found a way to prey on on a very fast moving, very strong creature, a fish. So in the chat, I'd like you to just enter one question you have about this snail-fish interaction. What would you like to know? Would you like to know, what would you be interested in? What makes you curious about what you just saw? Yeah, a question about how the paralysis happened. What if the snail misses? What attracted the fish to the snail? That's great. A question of how did this evolve? Comment that that predation on carnivory is disgusting, which I totally appreciate. Physiological question, how long does it take to digest the fish? Great. These are really good, thoughtful questions. So now what I'm going to tell you is it would be amazing enough, and this is just an insight into how the planet works. It'd be kind of amazing enough if there were one predatory snail. And to answer one of the questions, each species of these predatory snails has about 200 peptides in a venom sac. And they attack the fish's neuromuscular system in myriad ways, because it's necessary to paralyze the fish instantly. As you draw the fish in, it would not work if the fish woke up. It could tear the snail apart from the inside. So there's 200 little molecular machines that disrupt the molecular machinery of the nervous system of the fish. So there's not just one species, but there's an estimated 13,000, which is almost certainly an underestimate of the total number of species. So we don't live on a planet that is parsimonious. It's a very generous planet when it comes to biodiversity. Life keeps finding different ways to survive on this planet. But the other aspect of this, this is the biodiversity part of the story. The other aspect of this story is, because these toxins affect the nervous system, they can be used to study and understand the function of the nervous system, but they can also be used to discover new medicines. And so one of the first drugs to come out of this research on the biochemistry of how these snails can do this to fish is called Prialt. And it's one of the first non-opioid pain-killing drugs in decades. It's a whole new class of drug that acts on the nervous system in a novel way. And it is a non-opioid painkiller. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask you to use the chat and tell me which finding you think is more important. Do you find B, the biodiversity information, do you think that's more important? Or do you find D, the fact that we got a medicine from it, more important? B's and D's. That's great. I think I count, at least in those who have voted so far, the B's dominating. And yeah, Susan shares that this is like asking which is your favorite child, and I completely agree with that. It's not really a fair question. There's no reason we really have to choose. But one of the reasons I asked it this way is because when you talk about studying biodiversity as a biomedical research tool, that's really, reductionist science. And it's been powerful and it's very useful, particularly in the realm of medicine. But of course, the biodiversity discovery is more fundamental. And we can't predict ahead of time what other benefits there might come from it. And then again, thinking about the left side of the chart of why we should care about biodiversity, it's just wondrous. There's so many questions. So it's an amazing example of what we can learn from nature. And my idea, which I'm not really going to present evidence for, is that the more we know about biodiversity and enhanced by reductionist information, the more we can appreciate nature. I think it can increase our biophilia. I think, unfortunately, in education and science education, we don't often present it in the right way. We don't give people enough of a why to care about information. And I want to just give one more example of sort of what I mean. Just recently published a story map on hummingbirds. I picked hummingbirds for a bunch of reasons. I think there's a bunch of surprising things about hummingbirds. I'll just go ahead and tell you, they're unique to the New World. There's no hummingbird species in Europe or in Asia. They're all in North and Central and South America. If where you all are, presumably in Connecticut, but in the eastern part of the United States, there's only one species of hummingbird. And so for most of us, of course, it sort of forms our image of a hummingbird. But in the world, there's 350 species of hummingbirds. And so the point I want to make with this, if you have a look at it'd be great to have a look at the storyboard. I'd love to know your reactions to what you think of it. But part of my point is that on the left, we have a GIF here showing 4 different creatures schematically and how they fly. So one of the main characteristics of a hummingbird is this ability to hover. So they've been often compared to insects. And hummingbirds have many specialties, like they drink nectar, but that's not unique. Other birds do that as well. But the ability to truly hover is unique to this group. And it has to do with the way they use their joints in their wing. So hummingbirds essentially pivot their wings back and forth from the equivalent of their elbow joint, whereas most birds power their wings from their shoulder joints. And so you may have heard that hawks can also hover, but they actually need a little bit of headwind to do that. So hummingbirds are marvels in being able to actually hover. They're also, at the same time, even though they're small, they are masters of long distance flight, and they're epic migrators. So here is a map showing seasonally where you would expect to see hummingbirds. And so it's an indirect representation of their annual migration. And so from a conservation point of view, what territories do you need to protect if you're interested in protecting the ruby-throated hummingbird? Well, you can't just protect their nesting sites in the United States and Canada. You also have to protect their winter feeding grounds in Mexico and Central America. But the main point I want to make here is that I think my prediction would be, were I able to do a study with you, is that now that you know this little bit about hummingbirds, you're going to be more interested in hummingbirds. You may even right now be thinking, I'd like to go out and see a hummingbird. You're going to have to wait till, you're probably going to have to wait till next summer. They're already heading south. But so again, I think this is an example of the right kind of information, the right kind of science information can hone your interest and appreciation for nature and can increase your biophilia. So yeah, now I'd like to pivot a little bit to talk about, what does this really mean for most of us? And I pulled this quote from Fredrick Law Olmsted, who we are honoring with this series in part. And of course, most of us don't live out in the wilderness. And in fact, even getting to the wilderness is not something that all of us have the time or the resources to do. And, Fredrick Law Olmsted was really emphasizing, in a sense, learning from nature and bringing these natural elements into places like parks that were much more accessible to what we'll just call, a general audience. But what's interesting here, and the photo here is Jackson Park, where I grew up in Chicago. So the Olmsted Parks have influenced me long before I'd ever even heard the name. I've lived in several places around the country and had no idea that all these parks I was enjoying were in fact designed by the same man and his partners. But I like what he says about this scenery employs the mind without fatigue and yet exercises it. So he's emphasizing that tranquil aspect of nature in this quote, at least, as opposed to what I was questioning, whether there's an intensity factor. And that pyramid that I showed earlier, showing that, probably taking a stroll in a pretty park is a different interaction with nature than if you've ever been on a real wilderness overnight backpacking trip, for example. That's a very different experience than a stroll in a park. Now, in looking for evidence about whether knowing more enhances your enjoyment of nature, one of the places to look is birders. It's this huge subculture. And it's estimated that about 45% of Americans would at least characterize themselves as casual bird watchers, which includes having a bird feeder in your backyard, for example. But I think one of the most interesting things in this, let's see, I've got to move the chat box so I can read my own slide. The top reason is that they're just interested in nature in general and interested in birds. But the one that I really like that resonates with Olmsted is this: I like to actively rest in nature. So that that notion of being still, observing, being quiet, and yet being active, that's a state of mind. That's one of the things I like to do. I also like taking photographs, and it's somehow something that hones your observation skills. So there's some evidence that the more you know about birding, the more your appreciation is. Obviously, you get to know the names of more birds. I'm someone, for example, who is not interested in generating a long list. I like to know about the behavior of individual species. So there's another interesting place that we can look to probe this question about duration and intensity, and that's music appreciation. So I'm certainly no expert in music appreciation, but it's a very interesting field because almost like biophilia, maybe it's even more universal, the love of music. And it's generally acknowledged that it's purely for enjoyment. There is not, in general, a sense of utilitarian purpose for music. Can anyone think of a utilitarian purpose for music? If you can think of one, put it in the chat. Give it a thought for a minute and see if you can come up with a utilitarian purpose of music. Anyone? Oh, wait, let's see. I gotta go down and see the new messages. Sorry. Therapeutic. Okay. The teacher gets the gold star. That's right. So music therapy, which again, it's so interesting. It kind of ups the ante because now you have a measurable result you want. I just wanted to show this really though, just to get you thinking about, could we measure the value of intensity or duration with nature? And I think one place to look would be people who have studied music appreciation. And this slide is taken from a paper. And the conclusion of the paper is basically that somewhat, you might expect that if you listen to a song over and over, eventually boredom may kick in. And you might expect that more complex music, like certain forms of classical music, perhaps, would have more long-lasting value because there's complexity and depth as you listen over it. Well, their general finding is it doesn't matter. If the music is simple, if the music is complex, the more you listen, in fact, the more you appreciate. So it's an example of familiarity it's the opposite of familiarity breeding contempt. This from a different paper, really interesting, had some amazing data that was really honestly too complicated to show. And I have to admit, I didn't fully understand their analysis, but they did really interesting experiments having a jazz professional performer play saxophone and a professional performer play piano, and having hundreds of people listening, and then comparing what the performer was experiencing or thinking was going on at certain points in the performance versus the listeners. And it's maybe not a big surprise, the listeners who were saxophone players were more in agreement with the opinions of the sax player. Like, okay, this moment in my playing was a really great moment, or I was feeling this when I was playing that. They were in more general agreement, and then the same for piano. So anyways, I think this is an interesting place to look if we really wanted to study this question deeply. So getting back to biophilia and, again, taking it as a given that biophilia is real, whether it's a testable hypothesis, I'll just leave to the side for now. It's probably been mentioned in this course already, the importance of being exposed to it young. Now, I think it's another example. I don't know how rigorous the evidence is for it. It's another one of those things that this area is rife with. It just makes such common sense. We feel that it's true. I know there's been some retrospective studies, like among biologists or naturalists, ask them how early they discovered that they love nature, and it tends to be very early. And many people will anecdotally cite early childhood experience and memory. So it's one of these things, I accept that it's very likely true. You've probably heard of some of the work of Richard Louv, who has written a very, very influential book, globally influential book. And his website has a huge database of these studies. So again, I'll be agnostic for now and say early experiences are important. And I just wanted to point out another excellent book by a young Scottish man who's on the autistic spectrum. He's gotten a lot of attention in part because of that. But I would say apart from that, his writing is just remarkable. It's just beautiful, beautiful writing. And so he's one of these people who got engaged with nature very early. And in this passage I pulled from, he's talking about, a sense of loss when a natural place changes. And he's particularly talking about a bluebell woods, which is it's a unique European thing. We don't have bluebell woods, as far as I know, in the United States, but they take, actually, my understanding is centuries to develop. And bluebells are extremely slow spreading, slow growing. So when you have one of these bluebell woods, it's a really remarkable thing. And one of the points I want to make, but one of the things I want to mention here is, if it's true, right, that if biophilia is real, and if it's true that young experiences when you're young are important, then the question of access becomes extremely important. And who gets to have these outdoor experiences, it becomes an extremely important question. And so most of us live in cities now, right? The vast majority of the human population is in what we would call a city. And there's a big movement called, of sort of biophilic cities. I think I crossed out urban communities here because although I think it's exciting and super important to look at what cities are doing, I really want to make the point that it doesn't really matter where you live. Trying to apply some of these biophilic principles could be really important, because of course, the rural landscape is an extremely modified landscape. The suburban landscape, a very modified landscape. So the fact that it has less what I would call hardscape and less density doesn't mean that it's a natural, really a more natural or more wild place. The question is, how can we increase these natural experiences, and how can we support more biodiversity? And I just wanted to point out a couple of really important organizations, Biophilic Cities and London National Park City. And then I also wanted, I realized I've gone on too long here. I wanted to mention citizen science as another important development in this arena of appreciating nature. I feared originally when I started using iNaturalist that having my phone with me, having that technology might actually get in the way. But I actually find that in some cases, it increases my appreciation. It makes me slow down. But there's a huge access issue. And so I wanted to quickly introduce Deja Perkins. She's at NC State, and she's president of Black AF in STEM. I think everyone knows AF stands for autofocus, right? And she's done really interesting work on access and how citizen science apps are used. So for example, eBird is very common among birders. And basically this shows that observation, we have a huge ascertainment bias when we're using these apps. Sampling is much higher in higher income areas. And Deja has gone on to do really interesting work. This is New Haven. So she took data from the 1940s on redlining. I won't go deeply into redlining, but redlining is basically, I'll shorthand it by saying it's bigoted binning of different neighborhoods, right? It's stereotyping neighborhoods based on all sorts of characteristics, income, race of the folks living there. And again, showing that even though this redlining was officially stopped in the 1940s, the results of that come through today in bias, right? So like if you're in one of the, green zones, there's hundreds of observations of birds. If you're in a red zone, there may be very, very few observations. And this is not because the people living there aren't interested in this or don't want the opportunity. There's all sorts of reasons why they simply don't have the opportunity. So I should really wrap it up now. I can stay longer, but I don't want to keep all you folks after class. I wanted to just talk a little bit about where the future of this. And I put in because I listened to Mary Mahoney's talk, I put in my favorite picture of Teddy Roosevelt. This is at the top, that's Teddy as he was a boxer at Harvard College. So this is 7 years earlier than the photo that Mary Mahoney showed. You know, this is TR at his fittest. He's 135 pounds and he had a reputation as being a very scrappy boxer. So in some ways we could think of Teddy in the heritage of being conservation leaders. He had a big impact on conservation, but I just wanted to show this slide and of course include Rachel Carson, Aldo Leopold, and E.O. Wilson. E.O. Wilson is the only one of these sort of founders that is still living. These folks have been very important in shaping the way we view the landscape. And the real point I wanted to make is because they wrote beautifully, they've inspired a whole new generation of diverse writers, diverse voices, but inspired by these pioneers. And then here's someone like Deja coming in, kind of making the transition to this next generation. And of course, we want to give all young people the opportunity to have these biophilic experiences. And I want to close on this issue of equity and ask if anyone recognizes this man, Christian Cooper. Does anyone recognize Christian Cooper or recognize the name? He's sitting in Central Park. Is that any hint?
I recognize him. I can't find my raise hand thing, but yeah, I probably do recognize him.
Okay. Well, and here's a hint of what I'm going to talk about. This is some of Alitha's work. So Alitha and Christian Cooper got together, and I'm going to show you a sample of the work that they've produced. So this is getting at the fact, I'm so excited that The Naturalist is in graphic form. And then even more recently, this short graphic pamphlet, really, it's only about 10 pages long, came out. Does anyone recognize a face on the left of this image? Does anyone recognize George Floyd? So the very day that George Floyd was killed, Christian Cooper, who is an avid birder and birds frequently in Central Park, he is a board member of the Manhattan Audubon chapter. He had asked a woman who was letting her dog run free in Central Park, which is against the law and disrupts other people's use of the park. He'd asked her to please put her dog back on lead, and she had refused to do so. So he took his cell phone out and started taking photos and a video of her. And she threatened to she pulled out her phone and threatened to call the police and tell them that she was being assaulted by a Black man. So this sort of altercation really gave birth to something that's called Black Birders Week. And we've now had three Black Birder Week. Deja Perkins, for example, is a participant in that. Interestingly, this woman was fired from her job. Christian Cooper actually said he didn't think that was appropriate, but he wanted to tell the story of what it's like in this country, you know, to be to be a Black person and any other person who is not normally expected to be seen out enjoying nature. So to me, this is another really important point of this biophilia. There's other reasons why there's huge populations of people who do not feel comfortable being outside. And to my mind, that's really denying them an essential health benefit. And so, okay, close. I couldn't go the whole talk without mentioning one of the most unbelievable books I've ever read, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. I imagine part of the reason it speaks to me so strongly is Robin has amazing science chops, but she has a wonderful way of bringing her indigenous wisdom into the way that we think about nature, and how scientific approach, the approach I've really grown up with, how that can be meshed with other, especially in this case, indigenous American ways of viewing nature and people's relationship with nature. I can't recommend this book enough. And I think this is a fitting place to close. You know, she talks about restoration here. She invokes E.O. Wilson at the beginning of this passage and says, you know, really, you know, it's even the restoration of nature, I think, is something that's good for our brain health. Knowing that we're recovering it is something that makes us feel good and is a real antidote to some of the many negative things going on. And then here's a final quote from Ed. And I think I should stop sharing my screen. And if I'm happy to stay around, if anyone has questions, I apologize for going over time. Thanks for listening.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Liu. This is really, really fascinating and beautiful slides, a lot to think about. I have some questions, but we can talk at our leisure. So I wanted to open the floor to see if any students or any of our guests have any questions today for Dr. Liu. Please feel free to unmute yourself or just ask a question in the chat.
Yeah, please do. I understand people have to run off, but it would be just great. I'm getting lots of thanks and I really appreciate that. Again, I'm sorry for going over. You know, this is I haven't actually given this talk before. Maybe it shows. So that's what happens. It's a typical.
Well, yeah, it's so important. While people are thinking about their questions, I wanted to share just an anecdote about bugs and kids.
Yeah.
When I was house sitting as a college student, it was really fun because now I was like the head of household in this nice neighborhood with kids and everything. So I'd come home and play with the kids in the neighborhood. And one of the things we loved to do was make a bug zoo, which is you cut a little square of turf out of the lawn, right? And then we would dump like Kool-Aid, or the kids would have lemonade or pour a little sugar in there. Then you go back the next day and like lift up the piece of turf and see all the like bugs that were there that you normally wouldn't be able to see. So the kids and I had so much fun doing little bug projects and stuff like that.
That's awesome. Yep. So that was your bug period. It was a good one.
My bug period, exactly. But I was a college student at the time, so that was funny.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much, there's just so many things you can do. And I really believe the magic well is really a good metaphor, you know, which Carl von Frisch, who won, that's probably the only Nobel Prize given for animal behavior. And it was Carl von Frisch, Konrad Lorenz, and Nico Tinbergen shared the Nobel Prize. And Carl von Frisch is the one who, you know, solved the waggle dance of the bee, of the honeybee, and the amazing that they could use this physical dance language to communicate the specificity of food resources. But Carl von Frisch first said of the honeybees that they're like a magic well, and the more you learn, the more it gives you. And maybe it's such well, like so many of these things, it seems like common sense. It seems in some ways it seems inherently obvious, but I do think in the spirit of this course, it's worth trying to test and measure these things and find out, get as much evidence for making the case as possible. My personal goal would be to try and use this to improve science education, for example, to show that if you do it right, it enhances enjoyment. People want to learn more. We just so often don't approach it the right way.
Yeah, I totally agree. I have another more specific science question, but I wanted to see if anybody else has other questions in the meantime. There's so many things to ask about.
Yeah, I really appreciate people staying on. Probably being shy. You can always reach out to me. In fact, I'll put my email in the chat. You can reach out to me directly if you had a question.
Yeah, while you're putting that in there, the other question that I had, which is related to the half-Earth proposed by Dr. Wilson, there was a recent major paper called The Global Safety Net. And are you familiar with that paper?
I'm not sure who's the author, who's the principal author on that. Do you remember?
I think the first author is Eric Dinerstein.
Dinerstein, yeah, yes, I am familiar.
Yeah.
I'm familiar with their work. I also, just to mention, because I showed the Randall Munroe cartoon because I just love it. I love his work. I love the way he thinks. But Johan Rockstrom, if you want, and that's another thing, I didn't have time, but I can compile all the references for the things I covered. I'd be happy to do that and provide it to you and the students if they're interested. But Johan Rockstrom is, in a very rigorous way, studied all the various ways that we're pushing past our planetary boundaries, right? And causing overextension and depletion. And he's very good. He's a physical scientist. So it's beyond just the biosphere that we're depleting the planet. But of course, and one of his core arguments, though, is that by protecting the biosphere, it's a huge buffer against all these things, including climate change. Exactly. And we're going to start to pay. It's very likely that climate change is going to get more aggravated because we have taken the biosphere and its buffering for granted. And as climate change erodes the strength of the biosphere, we're going to lose that buffering. And we may find that our models have to get redone very quickly and that things could get much worse than we thought, even on the current models.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway, sorry, you were asking about.
Totally agree.
Yeah,
I think the interesting thing about the global safety net, and I know the half-Earth, it really focuses primarily on, these biodiversity hotspots, which are super rich in species. The global safety net seems a little bit different because it has a more kind of regional approach, like what are the key issues for biodiversity, and it identifies, I think, 30 or 30-something% of the Earth is really critical for biodiversity, and then you need another 20% as what's called climate stabilization areas. So New England is considered a critical tier 1 climate stabilization area because our forests are relatively young compared to how much carbon they can continue to pull in and store on the land. And one of the things I'm particularly interested in is, as I've talked to you a little bit about, is doing a real local translation of, these values of biodiversity and carbon and public health so that everyone can have access to their natural heritage. And we don't get so focused on protecting the Amazon that we don't provide people everywhere with a connection to their natural heritage. So that's one thing that, I've been trying to look at to help everyone to understand that where you live is, in a way, your little Amazon.
Yes. So I totally agree. So we are looking at adding those things to our half-Earth map, which I encourage everyone to have a look at. The principal layers on the half-Earth map, are biodiversity, because species are not evenly distributed, human impacts, and current protected. So to get to 50%, so hopefully people have heard a little bit about 30 by 30. That's on the way to the generally agreed upon goal of 50%. Because, why 50%? Because we can conserve the ecological functions that we're depending on. And so we're at 15% now, so it's a long way. And the US is at about 15% terrestrial protection. And if you look at the maps, you can see that there's not good alignment between where are the species, where's the protection. And you'll also quickly see that agriculture, urbanization, yes, that's a big effect, but agriculture is probably the biggest effect. And you can see all the challenges. And then we've added a priority layer. So one of the advantages of our approach, and by documenting where all the species live, is you can shift your stringency on your protection goals and just generate new maps and look at what the result might be. And this is also good in the real world, where we have to work with the communities that might be affected by these things, where you have all sorts of political issues within a country, but also international issues. So it's a very important it's a very important point. The other thing, a very fundamental principle of biodiversity is richness versus rarity. So if you look at richness, which is really pretty, it's as simple as how many total species are there in a given place? Well, you know, where we live, it's not particularly super rich. In some, like the United States is rich in amphibians, for example, and turtles. But you know, the Amazon is going to blow us away on insects. But rarity is the other important, and there's lots of ways. You may have heard the word endemic, range limited, but it means things that just live in particular places. Like the extreme example would be the bee hummingbird, which only lives on the island of Cuba. So those species are particularly vulnerable because if, you know, even if just a huge storm hits Cuba, that really could threaten the bee hummingbird. But it also means wherever you live, there are probably rare species that you should care about, that you should feel even more biophilia for. You should feel a certain amount of pride and stewardship. So we all have, there's nature that we all should have a particular and extra responsibility for beyond this. And that's part of the challenge of a global crisis that happens at this scale. We've got to figure out ways to make it mean something locally and close to home. And so there are many things that you can do as an individual, but it's super important to influence policy and law and influence the powerful decision makers. Oh, okay, someone has their hand up. Stefan or Stephen? Yes, please.
Uh-oh, let me make sure he can unmute. Go ahead, Stephen. Sorry, I had you guys all locked down.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no problem. I was just curious. Do you find any differences in terms of global awareness education from one country to another? Like, are there other countries that may be ahead or leading in having a model of climate awareness?
Oh, yes, 100%. There's definitely real differences. I don't want to put you on the spot, but are you, and maybe because you're in this course you've heard, but like, are you aware of COP26?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm afraid that the vast majority of your colleagues, even among, you know, college students, in the United States, there's a very low awareness. And, you know, it's kind of our long history of feeling a little separate and insular. And then what's happened, of course, over all these years, our presence and power on the world stage keeps going up, but we have this history that goes way back of feeling like we're separate. So in Europe, for example, I mean, they're all super aware and talking about COP26. And there it's a little different. We look for opportunities to say there is a lot of engagement and interest in biodiversity. So I very briefly mentioned London National Park City. It's a great example of, London, one of probably the world's leading cosmopolitan city, huge, rich, diverse city, extreme challenges in the UK. Their biodiversity, especially in the last 2 decades, has just been hammered. But they have a strong sense of urgency about doing something about it. And I would say there's more of a collective shared sense of urgency. And even though they have suffered some of the divisiveness that we have, and that, people have learned that there's ways you can drive wedges between people and disrupt dialogue, it's not as affected as it is in the United States. And then, I'll just mention another place that, just because I have personal experience, you go to a completely different place like Mozambique, when it comes to GNP or GDP, a very poor nation, but very rich in biodiversity, culturally, linguistically rich. Those people, many of those people are very attuned to the nature that they live with, and that's important to them. And I think you're going to find that in lots of areas. I mean, I have a little bit of experience, in South America as well, and I would have, it's a similar observation. But economics is so commonly used as a wedge between us, and it's such a short-sighted view. So this notion, this philosophical notion that we are part of nature, it absolutely applies. I mean, it's philosophical and it's also completely true. And it's both in this utilitarian realm and the aesthetic, ethical realm. But even if you just stick to the utilitarian realm, these short-term economic gains, if you really want to call them gains, that is such a short-sighted view. We're eroding all the systems we completely depend on. Anyway, sorry, thanks for your question. It's a great question. And I just to add one more thing, we're very sensitive to all the cultural dimensions to this, the many communities, and this absolutely cannot, so what we're trying to do is provide tools and information. It cannot be like a neo-colonial experiment, right? We can't be telling Botswana what to do, but we want to provide information and tools to help the best decision-making. And it does seem like there's a little moment now where the world is focused on these things. And even though COP26 is focused on climate, biodiversity got mentioned a lot. And I'm encouraged by that.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. I don't know where this was, but I do remember in the EU, they had something called the Green Oath, which was a pledge to do no harm to nature. And with a biomedical background, that's always my kind of first approach, right?
Yes.
First, do no harm. And so that means, if you have a healthy area where things are working, where people are living happily, you don't want to disrupt that. We want to spend our restoration time and money and everything on places where there are problems. So I agree with you. If you look globally, areas that are maintained and stewarded and live in harmony with indigenous people, they have quantifiably higher carbon and higher biodiversity than other areas. So we shouldn't be helping, those areas. And that's sort of true in every area. In Connecticut, we have some beautiful, beautiful areas, and we actually have the most carbon dense forests in New England, and some very healthy ecosystems that don't have any invasive plants and critical climate migration corridors. So, you know, what's surprising to me is despite all the beautiful nature in New England and in southern New England, very little of it is actually protected according to the principles of 30 by 30 or half Earth. So we need to really get a strategic plan, right, where we can prioritize where do we need to protect according to, you know, a very strategic, science-based, you know, ethical, compassionate plan. And then we can figure out where do we need to focus our money and effort, and what are the areas that are suitable for resource production and urbanization and energy siting and all of that kind of stuff. And without something like that, I just worry that our landscape and our, you know, beautiful natural areas are going to be, you know, death by 1,000 cuts, literally, without a strategic plan.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I just mentioned like one of the great organizations, it's actually based in Vermont, but the Northeast Wilderness Trust. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they're great to check out. And I know that you heard my rewilding podcast, and I talked a little bit about some of the mapping exercises that we do, but it really is, you know, if you even just look at some simple maps in the United States, forest cover, agricultural intensity, urban development, existing conservation. If you just look at those as static maps, you can quickly see, and if you add in looking at privately held land versus federal or state owned land, you very quickly see we can't get to the 50% in the US if we don't deal with the private land question. And so land trusts, there's important mechanisms that have to come into play in the United States. And of course, it's true for every country, sort of case by case.
Yeah. All right, I think I'm going to wrap it up there unless someone else has a burning question. I'll let my students go for the day, and thank you for your attention and really help me to thank Dr. Liu for this wonderful, wonderful presentation, and we'll be making it available and shareable after the fact. So thank you again, Dr. Liu, and have a great afternoon.
You're so welcome. Thank all of you. I'm really impressed that how many of you have stuck around. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Okay, Susan, talk to you later.
Okay, talk to you later.
That's great.